So let's talk through the core rules for Warhammer 40k boarding actions and how to play this 40k but indoors game mode with a new 10th edition rulebook. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where in this one I thought we'd do an overview for the Warhammer 40k boarding action supplement, one way to shake up the standard formula of Warhammer games and have really quite a different experience, with a bit more focus on close quarters firefights and battling room to room and hatchway to hatchway. The idea of this one is that it's basically an expansion to Warhammer 40k, using the core rules of 10th edition and the datasheets from the different faction codexes, but making the battle size really quite small and fighting over a close confined indoor terrain set, generally aimed to represent shipboard combat or fighting over a space hulk. The boarding actions rules initially came out in late 9th edition alongside the Arcs of Omen campaign series, and it used all the same terrain sets as the Kill Team Gallowdark style terrain. It worked kind of nicely in 9th edition, though then when 10th edition came out not too long after, it had a slightly lazy patch that didn't mean that everything translated over all that well. It only seems to be a year after 10th edition's launch that Games Workshop's gotten around to properly updating it, coming out with this enormous great big compendium book that both has the core rules updated and also content for each faction, plus a massive amount of missions. To play it, you need a collection of miniatures that can satisfy the demands of one of the detachments in the book, the codex for the army in question, plus the boarding actions rulebook, and then an actual terrain set to fight over. This one from Games Workshop with the standard boarding actions terrain set is £135 to $115 or €170. Kind of comparable with other Games Workshop terrain sets, though quite a pricey buy-in in my opinion. If you wanted to try out the system, there are alternatives available though, either converting or scratch building wall sections or using 3D printed pieces, where few people have made things that work consistently with this. As armies fight over the terrain set, there's some tweaks to the core rules, particularly with things like visibility and line of sight. Their own unique detachments, so you don't really use most of the contents in the codex bar datasheets. And as mentioned, there's a massive amount of missions in the book, so I aim to be a bit more balanced and try and provide a fair either player can win sort of system, more so than most, whereas otherwise a few more are a lot more chaotic or narrative driven, where things might be asymmetrical or rules for playing with multiple players. Breaking it down roughly, the boarding actions book has a core rules section with 25 pages, rules adaptations for the core rules of 40k, and then rules for tactical maneuvers, leaders, stratagems, enhancements, and basic army construction rules. Then the mission section is absolutely enormous, far more missions than I think most people would ever really need in practice, though it does mean that for all the different types of missions there's multiple different ones that you can choose from. So say if you wanted just to play multiplayer missions, there's plenty of those, and I guess having lots of supply of those isn't really a bad thing either. Most of them are kind of similar to the ones that came out in Arcs of Omen, but updated for 10th edition styling and collated together in one book rather than being spread across a whole series of them. Then there's a huge section of faction rules, around about 2 or 3 boarding patrols per faction. Pretty much all the major ones of 40k get them, besides knights, which are understandably too big to fit into cramped corridors. In general, you can't use things like monsters or vehicles in this game mode. Each of those detachments has their own unit list to choose from, plus stratagems, enhancements, and a detachment rule. As ever, if you are looking to pick up the book or the boarding actions terrain set, there's a whole bunch of discount retailers linked down in the video description below. Feel free to check them out if you want to order in boarding actions or some terrain. It does save a bit of money versus buying through Games Workshop Direct, and anyone using those links in specific will help support the channel a little bit as well. Though of course there's plenty of other discount retailers out there. Talking through the content though, first up we have all the core rules changes. I thought we'll go through them first, then a bit about army mustering and just talk through one example of a boarding patrol that you could field, and then just talk a little bit about the different flavours of missions with a couple of examples of how those work. First up, it's probably worth talking about which rules you actually use from your codex. It's basically just the datasheets, and plenty of those essentially have rules removed via the special rules on the boarding patrol detachments, and you don't use any of the codex detachments or even the army rules from the codex, or those are given to you in the boarding patrol sections. For the armies you use the current points from the Minotaur and Field Manual, but you don't use the balanced data slate, and they'll have a mustering rules document as its own balance patch if Games Workshop need to fix any elements of the boarding patrols, either because they've written non-functional rules or something is a bit overpowered and needs toning down presumably. Otherwise, broadly speaking, you use the standard rules for the turn sequence of Warhammer 40k with a whole bunch of changes. First up, when you're fighting over the terrain sections and you're deploying forces, one difference is that you don't have deployment zones, you instead have entry zones. These will be marked out on the map, kind of similar to the ones that you can see here. a bunch of them marked for the defender and a bunch marked for the attacker. When you cycle through deploying units, each entry zone can only be used by one of your units, but you can also deploy a character next to that unit as well. In boarding actions, leader units don't actually attach to the units they'd normally be able to lead in the game, but instead basically stand next to them and can sometimes boost them by a stratagem called Battlefield Command. In any case, once you've dropped your unit or units on that entry zone, it's no longer available to use, and any of your other ones will have to set up in the other entry zones or deploy off the board in reserves. For forward deployment type rules, scouts just basically isn't a thing in boarding actions. You can't use it to move forward, and infiltrators is kind of limited compared with what it might be normally. Infiltrate units can be deployed within 6 inches of an entry zone and still count as using it up, but they can't just deploy freely in the midfield like they might be able to in Warhammer 40K. Deep Strike in general still works normally for those units that have it, but you declare it in the deploy armies step, not the declare battle formation step, so a little bit different to core 40k games there. And also just generally with the theme of fighting indoors, most attachments have special rules for units with a fly keyword to lose deep strike, so you can't have things bounding down from the sky like jump intercessors. Wouldn't really make sense in a Space Hulk, so most of the things that can deep strike are ones that can teleport in one form or another. For movement changes versus regular 40k, the biggest difference in this game mode are things like the walls and hatchways. Walls and closed hatchways are basically counted as impassable terrain, and if you're measuring distances between units rather than measure them directly one to the other, the shortest distance is considered to be any one that doesn't cross a wall, including things like auras or other things that might affect other units between terrain. The same for engagement range, so you couldn't be in engagement range of an enemy unit if it was just the other side of a wall. Kind of makes sense there, the walls just keep things separate as you'd expect. Otherwise you also can't move through other models, they're generally considered impassable. And in general, fly keyword units can only move 9 inches or less, being a bit more constrained fighting indoors. One of the biggest differences to 40k movement are hatchways. They're basically things like bulkhead doors as part of walls, and they can be open and closed by your units or enemy units if they end their movement within 1 inch of them and then choose to operate the hatchway. If they do so, unless the enemy has movements nearby, you can simply change the hatchway from open to closed or closed to open. Could be nice for either keeping the enemy out or accessing an area that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get to. So there's a fun mechanic where if the opponent's basically got a model the other side of the hatchway, they can potentially choose to stop you if it's within 1 inch of it. Both you and your opponent have to roll off and add your model's toughness characteristic. The higher result gets to choose what happens, and if you're tied on the result, then nothing happens and the hatchway remains in the state that it was. So for a unit trying to operate a hatchway, you would have to overall beat the opponent's score. Finally, engagement range is slightly boosted through hatchways to allow people to fight through there a little bit more easily. It's boosted to 2 inches if you measure the distance through a hatchway, so it could make them better places to defend, and also could mean that if you open a hatchway and there's an enemy on the other side, then you can suddenly wind up in combat with them without charging. So maybe it could be a scary place to defend for nasty melee troops. For shooting changes, the biggest change is line of sight. Unlike in 40k when it's any part of the model being able to see any part of the other one, in boarding actions it's done base to base in straight lines. So that means that any walls and closed hatchways will block the way. It means that your own models can block line of sight. And it means that an enemy unit that's in front of a different enemy unit could potentially completely obscure it, even if basically all models are out in the open. The only exception is that enemy models that are in the same enemy unit don't block line of sight to the other ones. So say in the top example here, the Space Marine could still have full visibility to all the Necron Warrior models here if they were all part of the same unit. For shooting purposes, models gain the benefit of cover unless they're fully visible to the attacking model. So in the bottom diagram, the Necron at Model D wouldn't get a cover save, the one at Model C would for the Assault Intercessor, and then the one at Model B wouldn't be able to be shot at all. Again, in another difference to 40k, you can only kill what you can see, so you have to roll out your normal shooting sequence and allocate the damage. The difference is that you can only allocate attacks to models that are visible to at least one or more models in the shooting unit. So say if the enemy squad was strung out and there's one model towards the back that's just completely out of line of sight of any of the models in the firing squad, then that one basically wouldn't be able to be killed under normal circumstances. There's only a couple of exceptions with a certain stratagem, and if that hidden model was a multi-wound model that had already taken damage, in that case they're still able to take more damage to avoid multiple models being half killed out of an enemy unit. Otherwise, any weapons with the indirect fire rule basically can't use that particular rule in boarding actions, so no lobbing artillery shells around as you'd expect. and blast weapons only count the amount of visible models towards the total that they have in the unit. For the blast rule purposes, there is a stratagem to allow them, so under normal circumstances they're not quite as effective as they might otherwise be, though there is a stratagem that can allow them to potentially kill models that you can't see. Finally, for the main phase rules changes, there's a few tweaks to charging and fighting as well. As with shooting, you can only charge units that you have visibility to, so even if a unit's really quite close, if they happen to be around a corner and your squad hasn't clapped eyes on them yet, they still might not be able to charge them. And again, pile in and consolidate moves also require visibility, and have a couple of other tweaks in that they can move towards the closest enemy unit as opposed to closest model if it makes more sense to you. And you also can't use them just simply to move on to objectives and boarding actions. You have to end the pile in or consolidate move within engagement range of an enemy squad, so you can't just use them to grab objectives. Those are the main phase core rules changes, though there are a few more options that are gained. A list of tactical maneuvers that units can do, and also a list of generic stratagems that replaces the core book ones. For the tactical maneuvers, there's 3 of them. These are essentially kind of similar to actions in 40k 10th edition. You declare these with 1 or more units at the start of your shooting phase, and if you do so, then that unit can't shoot or charge if they decide to declare it, and you can't do any of these tactical maneuvers if you're either battle shocked, advanced or have fallen back, or have been set up on the battlefield, say from reserves this turn. The 3 tactical maneuvers are Secure Sight, which you can do with battle line units or certain other units that might have tweaked rules in a given boarding patrol to allow them to do this action, and it basically gives you sticky objectives on your objective marker if you do the action and then it completes at the start of your next command phase. Basically it means that you could have a troops unit move up onto an objective point, start doing this, and if your opponent can't take your unit down or claim the points, that objective will then be kind of stickied by you, so you could have marked it and then move forward if you want to press the attack further. Otherwise there's 2 sort of defensive damage ones. Set to defend, which means that you can't shoot or charge this turn, but you get +1 to hit in melee until the start of the next command phase, so it's 1 to go for if you think that your squad just needs to hold position, but your opponent is likely to charge you, and at least some of your unit is going to survive to strike back. Maybe it could be worth it if they literally can't do anything else, and being charged is at least a possibility. Though if your unit's got better ranged weapons, then setting Overwatch might make more sense. If you do this, then until the end of your opponent's next turn, you can fire Overwatch at an enemy unit when it becomes visible, whether it's via being set up from reserves, any move, charge, or opening a hatch. And it's got all the normal Overwatch things, where it's basically unmodified 6s are hits and nothing else is. Once you declare this, you can only Overwatch 1 target, so you couldn't do it multiple times if lots of different enemy units suddenly moved into view. You might not necessarily be able to fire with the whole squad though, if lines of sight are limited and depending on where your opponent puts models down. Otherwise, there's 5 different stratagems. This one's pretty massively cut down from the stratagem options in the core 40k rulebook. Things like heroic intervention are gone, as is the grenade stratagem, so you just get these 5. There's command reroll, counter-offensive, and insane bravery. Those ones are kind of staples and aren't really too different. I do notice that in terms of balance patches that have come out to those stratagems, they nerfed insane bravery by quite a bit very early in 10th edition, but it still looks like this one's got the old wording, only using it after a failed battle shock test and no restrictions to once per game, and the command reroll doesn't have the balanced data slate wording, where you can roll all your saves and then choose to reroll one of them, which I thought was an upgrade. Otherwise, for the 2 more interesting boarding actions ones, there's one called Battlefield Command. This one's to kind of compensate for leaders not being able to attach to units. You declare this in your command phase, and it means that your leader can use the leader ability on a squad of bodyguards that they could otherwise join nearby, but obviously can't due to this game not allowing it. Until the start of your next command phase, you gain any character benefits that unit would pick up, but not any benefits that the unit would get by being led by a character, such as -1 to wound and things, and you can't stack multiple copies of this on the same units. There is a generic enhancement that allows this essentially for free each turn, which could be an interesting one if you've got leaders with a powerful ability. Otherwise, for 1 command point, there's one called Explosive Clearance. This means that blast weapons in the unit count as being able to see all the units in a targeted squad that they can see at least 1 model of, and any of those models can have attacks allocated to them, so it could be handy if you've got a big squad of blast weapons just to do a very clean kill on an entire enemy unit, though I feel like you do need to have a critical mass of them to have that matter too much. Finally, for extras and upgrades, in boarding actions you also have a list of generic enhancements as well, something that 10th edition 40k doesn't have. So basically your forces will be able to choose any of these, as well as the 2 or so enhancements that you might get from a boarding patrol. Unlike in mainline 40k, they cost no additional cost, and you just basically get them free on 2 different characters if you happen to have character datasheets. Running through these, there's Superior Boarding Tactics, which is just starting the battle with 2 command points, which is kind of big. Close Quarters Killer, quite a powerful melee one with reroll wound rolls in melee. That could make certain characters enormously scary. Peerless Leader, allowing you to use that battlefield command stratagem for 0 CP every turn, and also do so if you've already used it this phase once before. That's nice for a character that does have a powerful leader ability, and the existence of that will make the leader abilities quite a lot more useful, and might be the most efficient way of getting that battlefield command stratagem rather than just paying for it when you need it. Otherwise, there's Expert Breacher. You can operate a hatchway at the start of the movement step rather than just at the end, so potentially it means that you could open a hatch and then have the character wander through, so pretty much guarantees that you're getting the jump on the enemy there. There's a personal teleporter for Deep Strike for the bearer, if you want a lone character going off on their own. And then finally a range damage enhancement called Trademark Weapon, +1 strength and +1 damage for a non-torrent weapon that the bearer's got. Might be relevant a bit more to certain factions versus others. You would need quite a serious gun for that enhancement to matter too much, I'd guess. Speaking of the enhancements, let's move on to army construction things. And this works kind of similarly to the standard 10th edition things, though again quite a few tweaks for the boarding actions detachments and the small scale of game. Armies must be 500 points or less from the Munitorum Field Manual, and the actual point total does matter a little bit, as the person who spent the fewest points might get an underdog bonus in certain missions. Not always something that's super impactful, but could be a little bit of a catch-up mechanic in one way or another. Then you pick your faction and choose one boarding actions detachment for it, so you can't use any of their codex detachments, but in the book basically every major faction gets at least 2 different detachments, so there is really quite a lot of stuff to choose from. Unlike with 40k detachments though, not every boarding actions detachment allows every choice of unit. The unit restrictions are spelled out individually in detail on each boarding patrol. Often you might have a good choice of different leaders that you can use to head up the army, and then maybe a bit of flexibility between squads, but often picking just between a few defined options. You can't go complete freestyle and mix and match anything that you want to, which might be a little bit annoying if you don't have the exact right combination of units due to what you've collected, and are sort of spread out between a few different boarding patrols. It seems that the actual boarding patrol boxes they released in 9th edition don't always map on perfectly as well, and some of the combinations don't really work to be able to be fielded as their own formation in this. Otherwise, beyond unit selection, you don't actually need a character in boarding patrol games, unlike in normal 40k, provided you've satisfied any of the conditions that are laid out by the actual detachment. If you don't take characters, you wouldn't be able to add those free enhancements though. As mentioned, you can take 2 of those, and they don't cost points, and regardless of whether or not you do have a character, you still need to nominate one model as your warlord. It has to be a character model if you've got one of those, though if not, it can be any other one. Finally, when setting things up, any 10-man squads typically get broken down into 2 smaller 5-man boarding squads, so a lot of units just operate in teams of 5 as opposed to teams of 10, even things that might normally only have the option to do so. So there'll be a few more multiple small units running around, though certain things have rules that override this. I'd say that you've got to keep the big 10-man squad all blobbed up, and that all functions just as one big unit. As mentioned, there's kind of a ridiculous number of boarding patrols in the book, and I'm not going to go through them all here. I thought we'd just take one as an example to illustrate the idea though. This one's the Death Guard Unclean Uprising, and it sort of feels like the Horde-style Cultist and Poxwalker Death Guard detachment. For this one you can basically have up to 2 characters. One of the major ones from this list where you could take, say, a Chaos Lord, Lord of Contagion, or Typhus, and then one of the sort of very own support characters, maybe a Biologist Putrefier, Foul Blightspawn, or Plague Surgeon or another. Then you get up to 3 units of each of 10 Cultists and 10 Poxwalkers, so could have loads of models on the board there given how cheap they are. And out of these, the Poxwalkers won't split into boarding squads, but the Cultists will. So lots of small units of 5 Cultists or a few big blobs of 10 Poxwalkers. Then you can have up to 1 unit of Chaos Spawn. Overall, there basically are enough units that you're going to hit the 500 points cap if you maxed out everything. And largely speaking, that'll just give you loads and loads of Death Guard chaff units and just a couple of slightly scarier characters to back them up. Then there's a section called Rules Adaptations. The biggest positive one is that cultists can use that secure site tactical maneuver as if they were battle line, so they can put down sticky objectives when they need to. And then beyond that, most of the kill teams tend to have whole reams of lose certain special rules. The Biologist Putrefier, for example, loses explosive maladies, the one where you can use the grenade stratagem for free, which I guess makes sense, seeing as that's not usable in this game mode. it would still have that lethal hits and critical hits thing if you were leading a unit, which you could add to some Plague Marines via the stratagem, though not really much use in this detachment given that they won't be able to take any Plague Marines along. Otherwise the Spawn lose their regenerating monstrosities, healing rule, and another 6 units all have lose this special rule kind of qualifiers, so in general the average datasheets might be slimmed down a bit compared with 40k. Otherwise, listed in the detachment you both get the army rule, which is slow decay, kind of a tweaked version of the Death Guard's Contagions of Nurgle. Contagion range in boarding actions goes to 1 inches turn 1, 3 inches turn 2, and 6 inches turns 3. And it also specifies that walls and closed hatchways are ignored for the purposes of this rule. So I guess that implies that you could still be having Nurgle's Rot affect you even if you're the other side of a wall from another unit, perhaps creeping through the ship a bit there. Otherwise, their detachment rule is Relentless Spread. You get to consolidate D3 plus 3 inches, and if you're unable to get into engagement range, you can go in any direction. So pretty nice for units being able to move their way throughout the ship. Though I guess it does depend on actually destroying things in close combat, which besides I guess these spawning characters that you might struggle to do with Horde chaff units. For the enhancements, there's just 2 on offer for this one. Pox Bearer for a once per game resurrects D3 plus 2 Pox Walkers, and Hand of Nurgle to allow your character to secure objectives in the command phase, getting that same sticky objectives type rule on a 2+. Finally, the detachments tend to have 4 stratagems on offer, and for these ones there's 1 command point for Pox Flare for the Pox Walkers to gain extra AP, Path of Pestilence for a cultist unit to be able to operate a hatchway at the start of the movement phase and then move. So I guess that could mean that they can move up a bit more efficiently there. A 1 command point 1 for the Dead Rise. A Poxwalker unit in reserve gets to arrive via Deep Strike, and you can only use that once. Kind of like the idea of some dead bodies coming back to life in the midst of the ship's hold there. And then finally for 1 command point there's Shambling Onslaught, where you can make a normal move after an enemy unit has fallen back from this unit. Still a bit unsure how effective the Poxwalkers would be without any major damage output here. But I feel like that detachment does the job of just illustrating what's usually on offer. You get 2 special rules, an army one and a detachment one. A unit list with a whole bunch of tweaks and adaptations, a few of them positive, though a lot of them basically losing various special rules, and a choice of enhancements that you can weigh up against the generic ones. Finally for the book, we've got the various different mission rules, and as mentioned they generally tend to be fought on preset terrain, each mission coming with a map where all the components are kind of clearly labelled. And they're all key coded so you can see, say, where these short walls apply to different places on the map. Most of the terrain bits are made up of long walls and short walls with different combinations of hatches on them. Your units set up in entry points, and then strategic reserves and things can arrive at entry points later in the game or via Deep Strike. As mentioned, the mission types are rather vast out here. I feel like outside of actually playing games, it's maybe a little bit more important just to talk about the different types of missions, as opposed to specifics of every single one. But broadly they sort of have the same sort of type and feel as the Arcs of Omen ones, but updated for 10th edition. For the options, there's symmetric missions, so sort of kind of balanced terrain with a symmetrical layout, so no one army is going to feel like they're at an advantage, and they're often fighting for objectives in the midboard. Asymmetric missions where different forces might have different objectives, say for example one force trying to break out of a jail, or one force trying to open a whole bunch of airlocks or power up a whole bunch of generators while the other force tries to stop them. There's all sorts of narrative missions with more wild and crazy rules, such as try and slay the big monster or having docked vehicles that can't move, and they've also got a mini campaign called the Rock Besieged, which comes from the Arcs of Omen. There's then some breaching operation ones which need some slightly different terrain sets, the idea being that you can have things to demolish some of the walls as you go about it. And it's meant to be played with the Killzone Soul Shackle terrain pieces, where you have walls with some big holes in them that I'm sure you could improvise. Dark Depths missions, which is a sort of funky idea where each player sets up one side of the board, asks for choice of a whole bunch of deployment maps, maybe trying to go for something that they think would be a good staging ground for their army, and then you combine those maps together to make a greater overall game. And finally, last but not least, multiplayer missions, with game modes for either 3 or 4 players, either duking it out on a free-for-all or going 2 versus 2. I feel like the smaller game mode with less wide-reaching shooting and fewer avenues for attack might be a little bit better for these if you're going free-for-all, maybe compared with standard 40k. Just to illustrate those a little bit, here's a couple of example missions. Here on the left there's a symmetric one where you have an attacker on the left and a defender on the right. There's 4 objectives to fight over down the midboard, and you can gain points for holding them, and the special rule is a fun deadly decompression one. At the start of the battle round, you roll a dice, and one of the 6 sections of the board all gets locked down with the hatches all closed, and then the units within all take D3 mortal wounds as the compartment gets vented. All kind of fun and a bit scary. That's going to randomly deal a whole bunch of damage to one player or the other, or both. And here on the right, there's a multiplayer mission setup. This one's called Dark Voices and has a mechanic to push the enemy warlords together. They have to try and make it into a safe zone, otherwise they're going to be taking mortal wounds at the end of each turn. And the safe zone shrinks down to quite a small bit in the centre of the battle. The other players getting big victory points for either slaying enemy warlords, or if they basically get killed by the killing zone special rule. That was quite a fun one and basically forces the other players to all be aggressive, as otherwise if they don't, then their warlord's just going to get slowly attritioned away if they keep them back too much. In any case, I think I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your thoughts as to the core rules of boarding actions for 10th edition. Is it something that you'd be tempted to give a try to or not? And what do you make of how they've implemented the 10th edition rules, both from a core rules and an army construction sort of point of view? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the content coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.